For years, Russia treated the Baltic Sea like a hallway, narrow, predictable, familiar, a place where ships passed through under watchful eyes but without real friction, a sea where monitoring was normal, yet interference was rare, a space where presence didn't automatically mean pressure. That assumption no longer holds. There is no announcement, no visible turning point, no moment Russia could point to and call escalation. What changed was subtler than that, and far more dangerous. The Baltic stopped behaving like open water. In 2025, Russian naval activity didn't suddenly spike. What changed was the response around it. The sea didn't get louder, it got sharper. Reaction times shortened, blind spots disappeared, routine transit started triggering coordinated attention instead of polite observation. And Moscow noticed. Because ships were still sailing, yet nothing felt free anymore. That's the part Putin didn't expect. This wasn't a crisis response. It was a system quietly snapping into place. NATO didn't close the Baltic by force. It closed it by making every action legible. Surface vessels lost anonymity. Submarine movements lost depth. Civilian traffic lost the ability to hide intent. What used to feel like open water now behaves like controlled airspace. And the shift didn't start with warships. It started with chaos. Over the past 2 years, the Baltic Sea has become one of the most infrastructure-dense maritime spaces on Earth. Power lines, data cables, gas pipelines, military communications, commercial backbones that entire economies depend on. When those lines began failing, the pattern didn't look accidental anymore. Anchors dragged where no anchoring made sense. Ships loitered where transit should have been continuous. Ownership structures dissolved into shell companies the moment questions were asked. None of it crossed the threshold of war. All of it crossed the threshold of tolerance. That's when NATO stopped treating the Baltic as a place to observe Russia and started treating it as a space to deny ambiguity. A new posture emerged without ceremony. Persistent patrols replaced episodic ones. Undersea awareness stopped being a niche capability. Legal scrutiny became operational pressure. Russian vessels could still move, but every mile now carried risk. That pressure compounds fast in a sea this small, because the Baltic doesn't allow distance, it doesn't allow delay, and it doesn't allow mistakes to disappear. Once NATO integrated Finland and Sweden fully into its maritime picture, the geography itself turned hostile to Russian freedom of movement. Coastlines aligned, sensor coverage overlapped, reaction paths shortened, even central islands that once felt peripheral began acting like anchors in the surveillance web. From that point on, Russian naval planning had a problem it couldn't solve with tonnage. The Baltic stopped being a place where intent could be tested quietly. It became a place where intent shows up immediately. And once that happens, navies don't need to be stopped. They just need to be contained. Before we go any further, quick thing. If you want more breakdowns like this that explain how power actually shifts instead of just reacting to headlines, tapping like helps this video reach the people who care about it. It genuinely matters here. Now, back to the Baltic. What's happening out here isn't about walls or minefields. It's about geography being activated. The Baltic Sea was never wide. It was never forgiving. It's shallow, crowded, and boxed in by coastlines that all bend inward. For decades, Russia treated that geography as manageable because it could still move through gaps that weren't fully connected. That assumption stopped holding. With Finland and Sweden inside NATO, the map stopped behaving like a collection of borders and started behaving like a single system. Surveillance arcs overlap. Patrol responsibility no longer ends at national lines. What once passed quietly between zones now moves through a continuous picture that doesn't blink. That's when freedom of action starts to evaporate. Russian ships entering the Baltic today don't fade between patrols. They don't slide through quiet seams. Every transit creates a trail that persists even after the hull is out of sight. The sea remembers who passed through it, when, and how often. That memory matters most at the choke points. The Gulf of Finland compresses traffic into a narrow corridor where distance disappears quickly. Movement there isn't about speed, it's about timing, and timing becomes fragile once multiple sensors are watching the same water from different angles. To the southwest, the Danish Straits quietly do the same job. They don't block access, they narrow it. Every vessel entering or leaving the Baltic has to pass through space that can't be widened, rerouted, or bypassed. That turns transit into an event rather than a routine. And this is where Sweden quietly becomes central. Gotland isn't a fortress in the cinematic sense. There are no dramatic ramparts or choreographed missile displays. What it offers instead is position. From that island, Sweden can observe traffic moving east to west and north to south without pushing force outward. Sensors placed there don't need to chase targets. They wait. That waiting changes behavior. Russian naval planners feel it immediately. Routes that once felt neutral now feel exposed. Schedules that relied on brief windows now run into continuity. Even when nothing happens, something is still happening. Information is accumulating. This matters because modern naval power doesn't begin with firing solutions. It begins with confidence. Confidence that a movement won't be instantly understood by someone else. Confidence that a patrol won't harden into a pattern. Confidence that escalation can still be paced. The Baltic stopped offering that comfort, and NATO didn't need to announce anything for the shift to take effect. What followed wasn't a surge, it was permanence. Ships that keep returning to the same waters. Aircraft that establish familiarity rather than novelty. Autonomous systems that don't get tired. Command centers that don't reset their understanding after each exercise cycle. The Baltic didn't get louder, it got steadier. That kind of pressure is hard to counter because it doesn't spike, it settles in. Russia can adapt to moments, it struggles against constants. Once the sea becomes predictable for one side and opaque for the other, containment doesn't need orders. It starts happening on its own, decision by decision. That's the environment Russia's Baltic fleet is operating in now. Not trapped, observed, and that distinction is far more dangerous. What finally forced this shift wasn't a warship. It was a tanker, not a modern one, not a well-insured one, not a vessel flying a flag that made anyone comfortable. An aging oil tanker, moving slowly through one of the most sensitive maritime regions on Earth, dragging more than just cargo behind it. That's when the pattern stopped being ignorable. By late 2024, cables started failing in places that didn't make sense. Power lines, data links, gas connections, not clustered in one dramatic event, but scattered across the Baltic and into the Arctic approaches. Each incident could be explained away on its own. Anchors slip, weather shifts, accidents happen, until they kept happening. Investigators began noticing the same behaviors repeating. Ships loitering, where no loitering made commercial sense. Course deviations near seabed infrastructure. Anchors lowered in zones that had been clearly charted as sensitive. Ownership structures that vanished into shell companies the moment questions were asked. By early 2026, more than 20 incidents across the Baltic and Arctic had been logged. In several cases, authorities directly linked damaged infrastructure to vessels tied to Russia's so-called shadow fleet. That fleet exists in a gray zone by design. Roughly 1,400 tankers, many old, many underinsured, many operating through opaque leasing arrangements that route ownership through Dubai, Azerbaijan, or paper companies that dissolve as soon as scrutiny appears. Their primary job is moving sanctioned Russian oil. Their secondary effect is presence. And presence in the Baltic is leverage. Through the Gulf of Finland alone, dozens of these ships pass each week. They move close to cables that carry civilian internet traffic, military communications, and cross-border power. They operate in exactly the waters where ambiguity can be exploited without firing a shot. Russia denies intent. At the same time, it defends the fleet's access aggressively. That contradiction didn't go unnoticed. When a Latvian-Swedish data cable was severed in January 2026, Swedish police boarded a Bulgarian-flagged vessel that had just arrived from a Russian port. Days earlier, a Finnish telecom cable was damaged under similar circumstances. Earlier cases, like the Aegeus tanker incident in December 2024, had already raised alarms about anchor dragging as a tool rather than an accident. At that point, NATO stopped treating this as a maritime safety issue. It became a security one. The response wasn't dramatic. No blockade was announced. No exclusion zone was declared. Instead, NATO launched something quieter and far more enduring: Baltic Sentry. This wasn't an exercise. It wasn't a surge. It was an always-on vigilance mission designed to sit over the sea like a mesh. Frigates, maritime patrol aircraft, and naval drones were linked with national surveillance systems across the region. The goal wasn't interception, it was continuity. Watch everything, miss nothing. Since Baltic Sentry went live, incidents dropped sharply in monitored zones, not because the sea became safer overnight, but because ambiguity became harder to maintain. Shadow Fleet ships suddenly found themselves tracked from entry to exit. Loitering became visible. Deviation stood out, patterns hardened. And patterns are dangerous for actors who rely on deniability. This is where the Baltic truly began to close. Not to commercial traffic, not to civilian shipping, but to actions that depend on blending into noise. The Shadow Fleet didn't disappear. It became constrained. Every movement now carried the risk of inspection, boarding, or sanctions that followed the ship rather than the flag it flew. Germany and Denmark tightened transit rules. Estonia and Poland began preemptive boardings. The EU, UK, and Canada sanctioned specific vessels tied to incidents. The United States pushed European partners to go further, framing the fleet as a hybrid threat rather than a sanctions loophole. None of this required escalation. It required persistence. And persistence is exactly what Russia didn't expect. Because once infrastructure protection becomes continuous, the sea stops being a backdrop. It becomes a monitored space where intent is inferred from behavior, not declarations. That's the problem Moscow now faces in the Baltic. Its navy moves under watch. Its shadow fleet moves under suspicion. And the line between the two is no longer as blurry as it once was. The Baltic Fleet doesn't operate like Russia's other navies. It can't disappear into open water. It can't stretch distance to dilute attention. It can't trade space for time. Every movement begins close to shore and stays close to shore. That reality used to be survivable because observation was fragmented. One country watched one sector, another covered a different slice. Gaps existed not because anyone designed them, but because coordination stopped at borders. That's gone. Today, the Baltic Fleet sails inside a space where coverage overlaps instead of hands-off. A ship leaving port isn't just seen at departure, it's followed as it crosses sensors that don't reset when it passes from one national zone into another. The track persists. Analysts don't have to guess where it went next. They already know. That persistence matters more here than anywhere else. Russia's Baltic Fleet is small compared to its northern or Pacific fleets. Its surface combatants are limited in number. Its submarines are diesel-electric, which means they depend heavily on predictable operating patterns, shallow water acoustics, and short transit windows to remain discreet. Those advantages only work when someone isn't watching all the time. Now they are. Anti-submarine patrol aircraft don't just show up during exercises. They operate routinely. Surface ships don't surge and leave, they maintain presence. Underwater sensors don't get packed up after drills. They stay in place. What used to feel like activity now feels like environment. That's a dangerous shift for a fleet designed around short bursts of access. The choke points make it worse. The Danish Straits compress outbound traffic into narrow passages where speed, depth, and maneuver options collapse. The Gulf of Finland funnels ships into predictable lanes, bordered by coastlines that host sensors, patrol craft, and aircraft with minimal transit time. There's no room to be clever there. And once a vessel passes those choke points, it doesn't enter freedom. It enters continuity. Every transit becomes a data point. Every patrol adds context. Over time, behavior becomes readable. Readable behavior becomes predictable. Predictability is the enemy of deterrence. This is why the pressure feels asymmetric. NATO doesn't need to match the Baltic Fleet ship for ship. It doesn't need to challenge every movement. It only needs to maintain awareness long enough for Russia's own planners to lose confidence in surprise. That loss changes everything. Operations that rely on timing get delayed. Exercises lose ambiguity. Deployments start feeling exposed before they even begin. Crews sense it, commanders account for it, headquarters internalize it. Nothing dramatic happens. That's the point. The Baltic Fleet isn't being defeated at sea. It's being constrained in advance. Its operating environment now punishes initiative and rewards caution. Over time, caution becomes habit, and habits shape doctrine. Russia built its Baltic posture around the assumption that this sea could still be managed through presence and signaling. What it's facing now is something else entirely. A space where presence is always noticed. A space where signaling is immediately interpreted. A space where movement itself creates vulnerability. That's what closing the Baltic actually looks like. Not a barrier you can see, a condition you can't escape. Beneath the Baltic surface sits a layer of infrastructure Europe can't afford to think about casually. Electricity moves between states through cables laid decades ago. Data crosses borders along routes never meant to be contested. Energy flows through pipelines optimized for efficiency rather than survival under pressure. For a long time, those systems were treated as background conditions. That changed when interference stopped being hypothetical. Nothing about it fit the shape of traditional naval conflict. It applied stress without leaving fingerprints. That shift forced a change in how NATO viewed the sea itself. The Baltic stopped being treated as a passageway and started being treated as a system that required constant supervision. That mindset produced Baltic Sentry, not as a show of power, but as a response to vulnerability. The patrols weren't built around confrontation. They were built around removing anonymity. Ships, aircraft, and unmanned platforms weren't tasked with chasing targets. They were tasked with staying present. That distinction matters. When monitoring becomes continuous, behavior adjusts on its own. Vessels tied to opaque ownership lose the ability to linger unnoticed. Suspicious transits lose the benefit of ambiguity. Cable damage stops being dismissed as bad luck once observation becomes routine rather than episodic. That's the Baltic now, not a battlefield. A monitored space where Russian planners, naval crews, and commercial operators all operate under the same assumption every time they move. Someone is already watching.